All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're on to another brand new lecture here, and we're going to start learning about something called variables. A lot of new stuff coming at you all at once in the beginning here, but we got to learn the basics before we can get deep into something complicated. So we're starting with variables. This is a really important, really fundamental topic to programming. So some objectives for today. You're going to be able to declare variables using a dim statement, and we'll learn about that in a second. We'll learn how to use well-named variables to store information, and we'll be able to compare and, I should say, contrast a string variable and an integer variable. So those are two different types of variables. We'll see that in a second. All right, so we'll say what is a variable, we'll talk about what is declaring a variable, we'll talk about integers and strings, and then we'll be done. So let's start with what is a variable. All right, so a variable, this is a really important topic, so make sure you're paying close attention. In math, you've probably heard the word variable before. Here's the equation y equals 5x squared. A variable is something like x. It's a symbol that can represent a bunch of numbers, right? X can be 2, x can be 7. It's a variable. It can vary. That's where variable comes from. It's variable. It can vary. In computer science, it's a similar idea, right? We have this thing x that we can put numbers into. And in computer science, it's similar. A variable is a storage space. It's a space on the computer where you can keep a piece of data, like a number, for example. So when you think about a variable, you can think of it as a little place on the computer, like a little box, and the number gets put inside. So if we were to save the number 3.141, okay, we could put it inside a variable, and it's kind of like a little box. The computer puts the number there, and it hangs onto it, and it knows, yep, that number is in that box. I remember it's there. Okay, so it's kind of like a little storage space, your own personal locker for a piece of data, like a number. It could also be a word or a piece of text, so hello. Okay, you can store that in a variable. And the whole point of this is the computer says, okay, I know that I've put a piece of text in there in that variable, in that little box. Okay, and you can have lots of variables, not just one, and you can put all kinds of different words in there. And you can have, some programs have thousands, hundreds, millions of boxes, millions of variables where stuff is stored. But we're going to start with just one or two for now. All right, so the next question is, okay, so a variable is a storage space where we can keep a piece of data, but what do we use it for? And so I'm going to give you a quick and easy example. Let's say we have our computer and there's a program running it. You can see the computer down here, and there's a program running on it right here, which is it has a text box in it. Okay, and our program, what do we use the variable for in the program? So we can say, all right, they're very important when we want to hang on to a number or a piece of text for later. Right, so if I want to hang on to something and do some other stuff and come back to that original number or that original piece of text, variables are perfect. So for example, I could say, make up a variable, let's call it my variable, and I'll say, okay, my variable is equal to 12. And what the computer does is it says, okay, I'm making a new box and I'm putting in 12. Okay, I've got my box, it's my variable, and it's got the number 12 in it. I'm storing that data. And then the computer can churn around and do a whole bunch of other stuff. Here's a bunch of just junk code that I wrote. It can do a whole bunch of other things. And meanwhile, that 12 is still stored in my variable. It's still in that box. And so if I was to call another piece of code like textbox.text equals my variable, then the computer can say, okay, I know that variable is in that box. I left it there before, and so I can put it right in the text box like that. Okay, so variables are good for if we want to hang on to something and then go do something else and then come back to that original something. We've got these little storage spaces called variables. Okay, so before we use a variable, we have to learn how to declare it. So that's a really important part of what we're going to be doing today. So what is a variable declaration? This is kind of getting a lot of terminology here. This is going to be one of the vocab words, a declaration. Variables hold information, right? That's what we just said. It's a little storage space for information. But the question is, how much information can it hold? Can it hold an entire library's worth of information, or can it hold just one number? Okay. But generally, a variable holds one number, one set of letters, one thing. Okay. But even if you're just holding one thing, the computer needs different amounts of space to handle different types of things. So for example, it might need this much space to hang on to the word hello. Okay, but it probably just needs a little bit of space to hang on to the number 2. Okay, or if it was a more complicated number like pi, then it would need 3.1. It needs a little bit more space, okay? So the size of the box, the size of the variable, the amount of space that the computer has to reserve for the variable varies depending on what type of data the variable is. So that's kind of confusing. So let's just say that one more time. The size of the box, the amount of memory that the computer needs to set aside for this variable, for this data to be stored, varies. It changes depending on what type of data you're storing. If you're storing a word, it needs to save some amount of information. If you're storing a number, it needs to save more or less. And so we have to tell the computer what type of data we're going to be putting in this variable so it can set aside the necessary information or the necessary space. Okay, so a variable declaration tells the computer what type of data to set aside space for. How big a space should the computer set aside based on what type of data we're going to be putting in the box. All right, so in Visual Basic, some programming languages actually don't require that you declare variables, and that's considered to be like a really nice thing because you don't have to worry about it. But in Visual Basic, unfortunately, we do have to worry about it. But it turns out to be an advantage because then your program handles its memory usage a lot better. So that's something for later. But how do we do it in Visual Basic? So we have to use something called a dim statement. Variables must be declared before they're used. That's important, right? You can't use this storage space if you haven't told the computer where, how big should the storage space be. And we tell it that by using a dim statement, okay? And this is what a dim statement looks like. It starts out, of course, with dim, D-I-M, okay? That's the first and most important thing. And that stands for dimension, okay? Because it's kind of, I don't know if familiar with the word dimension. You can say the dimensions of something. Like if I have a square, its dimensions are it's 4 feet by 4 feet. So you can sort of think dim is like telling how big, what are the dimensions of the space that we're setting aside. So dim says, okay, hey computer, I'm declaring a variable here. I'm giving you dimensions. Okay, so you always start, whenever you're declaring a variable, you have to use dim. Okay, after that, then what? Now we tell the computer, okay, I'm going to give this variable a name. I'm going to call it something. And so after the dim, we put a space, and then we write the variable name. And so you have to give every variable that you do, you have to give it a name. You don't want to be stupid about it and call it variable 1, something silly, right? You want to call it something that means something. So if I was writing a program to calculate how much money I made selling lemonade, then the variable could be called cost of lemonade, okay? Or it could be number of lemonades that I sold that day, okay? So you need to make the variable names mean something. When we have 30 variables, if you call all of them variable 1 or x or something like that, you're going to get pretty confused pretty quickly. So name your variables what they are, okay? Another important thing, you can't have spaces in the names of your variables. So they have to be one word. And so you should capitalize, like I did for variable name, for cost of lemonade. You should capitalize each starting letter of the word so that you can read it more easily, right? Okay. Then we have to write the word as, okay? So we're dimensioning or we're declaring the variable name as, and then we say what type of variable this is going to be. So this variable could be a number of different things, but we have to tell the computer what type of data it is. Is it a number like an integer? Is it a more complicated number like a decimal? Or is it a piece of text? We have to tell that to the computer. Okay, so every time we make up a new variable, every time we want to set aside space for the computer to do its job, okay, we have to say dim, which says, hey, I'm declaring a variable. Then we have to say the name of the variable that we're making up. Okay, and we're going to make that name meaningful. We're not going to just use junk throwaway names. Then we're going to say as the variable type. And we'll talk more about some specific variable types in a second. That's really important. You're going to type stuff like this 100 times this quarter, so make sure you got that in your head.